Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Tara. It was great to hear that story of working through the storm and some of the lots of amazing work going on at the San Antonio Zoo. Um, Kara, thank you again so much. Tim, once again. And now for our last session, we talked a little bit about the innovation and what this and about lessons learned across the first two sessions. And so now we'll get to hear from Emily Royal from the City of San Antonio Innovation Office, Chris Moyer from the City of Detroit Regional Chamber, and David Dolehite, the Managing Director of Bridgewater Consulting Group. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Aaron Oten, who's going to be moderating this session, and looking forward to a great last panel. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. I'm very excited to have this conversation. And I think that last session was a great lead-in. One of the things that Tim talked about that's really applicable to this session was applying that lesson learned of, during COVID, opening up drive-through visits and realizing that that was actually more equitable and made things more accessible to other people, and that they plan to keep that option for the future. So those are the exact kind of things we're going to be talking about today on this session. So let's kick things off. And David, I'm going to start with you. You have sort of that broader perspective. So can you speak to what you've seen across the board with respect to how we've had to rethink our normal routines and how that might affect innovation?
Yeah, absolutely, Aaron. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. One nice thing about consulting is you get to see a lot of things, and boy, have we seen a lot of things in the past 18 months. When you think about the innovation, a couple of things to kind of keep in mind is innovation isn't always the new shiny penny. A lot of times it's just doing things differently. And we definitely done some things differently over the past 18 months. And Emily and Chris and I were talking earlier about making sure that we hold on to some of these things in the way they've changed. And a couple of the statistics that have kind of popped out to me is I talked to other industries, and especially the utility industry and municipal industries, are that the customer or employee satisfaction and worker productivity are both at all-time highs. So this disruption of people having to work from home, people have found a way to adapt and innovate around that to drive, again, worker productivity for people that measure it kind of ad nauseum, and the employee satisfaction to levels that they higher than they've ever seen. The other thing I can talk to kind of a personal note is David had learned to talk without a whiteboard. And so, I've noticed too, I don't know, and maybe, Chris and Emily, Aaron, y'all can comment on this, but, the staying at home, people seem to be much better informed about a broader range of topics than they ever have been in my memory. I don't know if they watch a bit more things, or they read more, or they're just better engaged, but it seems like this kind of loss of personal interactions has been made up with really staying abreast of what's going on in the world, kind of being more aware about what's going on around you, rather than just the things you're focused on. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of what I've been seeing more broadly as just human adaptability to cope with the situation and make the best out of it.
Thank you. And Emily, kind of zeroing in more on the local level, how have things changed for you, when it comes to taking action? How have city workflows been affected? And are there innovations that you've seen or that you think you'll see coming as a result of that?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Aaron, for having me, and of course to Z Prime and CPS Energy and Bridgewater as well for hosting this awesome event. So yes, for local governments, a lot has changed and transformed in the past 12 months. I would say in particular for the city of San Antonio, but also maybe more broadly for local governments, there's really three areas that I think there's been quite a bit of innovation in order to adapt to the effects and impacts of COVID-19 on our communities. The first one is around digital inclusion. Very, very popular word right now, but certainly bringing forward internet access to everyone equitably. We saw with remote learning and schools bringing education and courses and everything online that many of our students in our community were left out. have a ton to say on what the city of San Antonio is doing around that, but that's one critical area. Another area is data governance. COVID-19 really required us to think about data as a public good, and something that was really critical public health information that we needed to deliver directly to residents, and build the infrastructure to do that with great urgency during the pandemic. So data governance is really one area where we've had to reshape, reimagine how data flows through our organization, and what our goals are around transparency and accessibility of that data for our residents. And the third area is really thinking about resilience, and community resilience, not just around COVID-19, but certainly what we've been talking about a lot on this event so far around the impact of the winter storm and climate change. So the Office of Innovation is pursuing projects in urban agriculture, and also we have our ongoing Smart Streetlight initiative with CPS Energy as one of our Smart SA partners that's focusing on generating new data sets around air quality, temperature, flooding. That's going to really help us identify urban heat island effects and the effects of climate as an equity issue in our community as well. So I'd say probably those three topics: digital inclusion, data governance, and resilience in our community are the biggest change drivers right now for San Antonio.
Great, thank you. And I know we'll get into that in a little bit more detail a little bit further into the conversation. So Chris, my former colleague, I know that, there's been a lot of conversation about how we recover and make sure we're more resilient. And so I know one of your favorite topics of conversation is the policy angle. So can you talk to us a little bit about the American Rescue Plan that the Biden administration passed? What are some of the innovation opportunities that the plan might provide for Detroit and other cities?
It's great to be back at a Z Prime event. And while I am now the Director of Communications for the Detroit Regional Chamber, which is the third largest chamber in the country, I am a proud Z Prime alum and will forever have a fondness in my heart for my Z Prime friends and colleagues. So it's great to be back. Thank you for having me. And it's great to see friendly faces on this panel. David and Emily, we've had the pleasure of working together before. As we look at the American Rescue Plan, this is a foundational investment in how cities, states, counties, local government entities can not just recover from the past, the economic impact and the interruption and the public health tragedy that has occurred over the last 15 months, but really make a down payment and investment in the future. And that's, I know that whether it's Detroit or San Antonio or many of the other dozens of communities that the Detroit Regional Chamber represents around Southeast Michigan are looking at this money as an opportunity to make those sort of critical investments. And that's what the chamber has really called on government leaders in the state of Michigan and at the county and city level to do. Let's use the tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that get filtered down to invest in updating public health infrastructure, public health records, so that we are better prepared in public health emergencies like COVID-19 in the future. As Emily mentioned, we face this growing threat of climate change, and many communities can use this to harden their resiliency, be more prepared to either mitigate natural disasters or respond to those natural disasters when they occur. And then, of course, transformative city of the future technology that can help make us a more connected, better informed citizenry and public sector. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about some of the specifics of what's in this $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan and what that's going towards, just under $200 billion of that is going to go to states in the District of Columbia. Counties around the United States are receiving $65 million. Metropolitan cities are receiving $45.6 million. Tribal governments, $20 million. Territories, $4.5 million. And non-entity units of local government, that's often school boards, they're receiving 19.5 billion. And excuse me, I was saying million, but this is 65 billion for counties, 45 billion for metro cities, and all of those numbers were in the billions. So this is a tremendous investment in education opportunities, grid and city modernization, and really, this is a transformative moment for our country.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think there's a lot in there that we can't touch on, but you did mention education. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I think one thing that was really highlighted during the pandemic was the digital divide. And Emily, you touched on that in your comments earlier. I feel like getting broadband into homes doesn't sound innovative, but the fact that it's still something that's an issue in 2021 shows that it'll take innovative solutions to fix the problem. So Emily, can you talk a little bit more about that, what you've learned about digital divide issues since last March and ways that San Antonio and your office has been addressing those issues?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, we recognized pretty early on in our office that there were significant gaps in the data that we had available about San Antonio's digital divide. We were relying primarily on federal and regional estimates for folks who were lacking broadband connectivity in the household. And so we took advantage of that to host our own survey and engagement effort to really communicate with our residents and try to figure out with a boots on the ground approach, what is the issue and where are the disparities in our community. So we did build a digital divide assessment. That assessment was so serendipitous because it was finalized in January, right before the pandemic hit. So we entered the pandemic equipped with hyperlocal data about the digital divide in our community. And what I mean by hyperlocal is that we're really able to pinpoint census tracts and zip codes that were lacking broadband internet connectivity to the home. Looking at demographics, age, student populations that were lacking this internet connectivity, and also issues around digital literacy and devices. We use this term, the three legs of the stool for the digital divide. It's not just about delivering internet access to households. It's also about, do people have the ability to afford internet subscriptions? Can they afford the devices that they need to log on to the internet? Are they relying on cell phones? Do they have desktops? And then the digital literacy question, right? Are folks really able to understand some of the security risks, the privacy issues around using the internet? Do folks know how to check their email, right? We've got people in our community that are at all varying skill sets around accessing the internet and using information communication technology. So what we discovered in our assessment is that about 20% of our residents lack broadband internet connectivity to the home. This is one of the higher rates of cities in the country in the United States. So we were able to apply for CARES Act funding to help us support interventions that would allow us to bridge some of those gaps. And we targeted students as our primary population to do that. This is our Connected Beyond the Classroom initiative, which really works with a number of partners in about 8 school districts to pilot delivering wireless, fiber, and communication tower technology to deliver internet access to students in designated neighborhoods. There's a whole approach for how we chose those neighborhoods. We took an equity lens approach. We have what's called an equity atlas. on the city's website that helps us identify neighborhoods with vulnerable populations, and we targeted those neighborhoods and those school districts first for a proof of concept. We're working on evaluating that, and then we'll move to hopefully scale to more neighborhoods throughout our community. This whole approach, which is very multi-stakeholder, it takes a lot of community engagement to accomplish, led us into a space where we started thinking, well, how can we build this as a model for our entire county and our whole region? And so now we're working on a digital equity roadmap, which hopefully will prepare all the stakeholders in our ecosystem to take advantage of the stimulus funding that is coming down the pipeline for broadband. And we're really trying to turn over the keys to our community to help them apply successfully and participate successfully in those kinds of initiatives. So that's kind of the overview on the status of digital inclusion right now in our community.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think since COVID, a lot of the focus has been on school children that haven't had access to the internet, but I'm glad that you touched on sort of the broader overall problem, and that there are a lot of older people that don't have access, or just the, you know, that digital literacy issue. Chris, what about you? I know you shared a stat with us on our prep call about Detroit that was sort of mind-blowing. So can you talk about digital divide and what you've seen in Detroit?
Well, I certainly think that the city of Detroit has a lot of the same challenges that San Antonio has, and many other major metro cities do. Before setting up this statistic, I want to point out that the state of Michigan did an analysis that looked and said, jobs of the future, what is it going to take? What type of educational criteria is going to be needed to serve in those jobs of the future? And they believe that 75%, the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity believes that 75% of the jobs of the future are going to require a post-secondary form of education. That's either a 4-year, 2-year, or professional certificate degree. Currently, the state of Michigan, as an entire state, our attainment is at 48.6%. So the delta between what it's going to take in the future to have productive employment and where we are now is more than 25%, and that's a very daunting task. So the Detroit Regional Chamber, along with the state of Michigan and Governor Whitmer, put together a plan called 60 by 2030. And that's to help raise attainment of those professional certificate, 2-year, 4-year degrees to 60% by the end of this decade. Now, how are we making progress in that? The digital divide, and this is the statistic that you were referencing, the digital divide is this major challenge. The city of Detroit has just over 50,000 students in the Detroit public school system. Tremendous progress was being made in DPS before COVID. But even before COVID, 2/3 of those students do not have regular access to the internet outside of their school setting. And when you take those students and then layer on the challenges that we have seen with COVID, where many had to be remote for months, if not the entire school year, we were looking at a situation where the learning loss was going to be exponentially worse than some of their suburban contemporaries who have regular access to digital connectivity. Fortunately, business, city, a public-private partnership stepped up in a big way and did work to provide free internet access to many of these school children, to all of these school children. That was the intent, and then also additionally the hardware needed to access the internet when they were studying remote. That was a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, but it certainly is reflective of the acknowledgement that we have as a city and as a region, that to ever achieve 60% and hopefully 75% educational attainment, it can't just be the people from the most well-off parts of any region in any state. And I'll just tell you that those numbers, Michigan is not at the bottom of 2-year, 4-year professional certificate attainment. We're not at the top either. Those are areas like Seattle, parts of California, but we're in the top 15. So many other states are facing these exact same challenges.
Thank you, Chris. All right, I've got a couple more questions, but just want to let everyone...
Aaron, can I chime in on this one? Just listen to,
Sure.
to Chris and Emily. Sorry, I can't be quiet. I think we have to keep in mind that, this is just a huge transformation project. And I think probably many people, on the phone have been involved with big transformation projects that fail because we pay attention to the technology and think the technology is going to solve the problem. And it's kind of Emily's statistics highlighting, the magic is in the change management. It's addressing the cultural norms. It's getting the community inclusion. It's the outreach. It's the education. The technology is an enabler, but it's just the first baby step and kind of achieving the goal. So, as we go through this and think forward, I think, we need to kind of pay a lot of attention to these softer issues that get these numbers up in the community.
Yeah, David, that's actually a good lead into my next question for you, which is how do we ensure we don't lose sight of some of the lessons that we've learned over the past year and a half, especially, and how can we apply them so that we're using new technologies in ways that will make a positive difference?
No idea what to set up. One thing I'll call it a little story here is, we worked with a large utility who agonized over going to remote call center working for 3 years. They knew it would improve, on-road safety by keeping the cars off the road for the employees. They knew it would have an impact on climate change. They knew it would have a better work-life balance for people. Yet, for 3 years, they couldn't pull the trigger because there's going to be such a daunting technology challenge. Yet, with some help of their partners, they did it in 3 weeks. So once sort of the impetus and they were forced to take that step, they got it done in 3 weeks for something that they agonized over, a 3-week challenge. So, I guess my point is some of these things are not nearly as daunting as we think they are. It's that first step. And then, also something I hope that we don't lose sight of is, I had a great boss and he would say, first question to a new employee, what's the hardest step? Of course, the correct answer is the first step. And he goes, no, anybody can take the first step. It's the second step that's the hardest, because that implies direction and momentum. And, we talked about this earlier on our kind of prep phone call. We've taken a lot of great first steps because of COVID, because of the pandemic. It's forced us to rethink things. And, the shame will be if we don't take the second step and keep that direction and momentum going.
Thank you. Chris or Emily, do you guys have any follow-up to what David talked about?
Well, I really like David's perspective on this being a process and cultural change. As we look at what makes cities of the future and what's going to attract people to come to our cities, our regions, it's going to be about economic opportunity and quality of life. And those two elements really require a lot of a cultural awareness of how we want to operate in the future. In the 19th century, when the United States was primarily an agrarian society, an 8th grade education was going to be sufficient. Quickly into the 20th century, in the early to mid 20th century, it became apparent that 8th grade education was no longer going to cut it when it comes to maintaining that economic opportunity and quality of life. And so it became, everybody needs a high school degree. Now we are firmly entrenched in the 21st century. And it is clear again that simply a high school education is not going to do this. And it can't just be about kids coming up that are in K through 12 right now, going on and seeking that post-secondary degree. We have to make sure that adults that just finished their high school degree or their GED have the opportunity to go back and get a professional certificate, get an associate's degree. But the culture needs to permeate all facets of society and say education is the pathway to a good quality of life and economic opportunity.
To connect kind of two of those threads together, Aaron, I really liked how David described this idea of like the first step is easy and then the second step, demonstrates intent, right, and momentum, and that's the sort of culture change step where as an organization, you're acknowledging a desire to drive a cultural shift within the organization. I can speak a little bit to, what I think it takes to do that inside of local government. From that sort of standpoint, to create a culture change within an organization like a city government, right? I think you have to have like two really key parameters. The first one is leadership buy-in and support, right? You need kind of that top-down approval and support for changing the vision for how a system operates in a city. So thinking about like data governance, for example, lots of lessons learned from the pandemic for the city of San Antonio in how we manage data and make it accessible to residents. That was something that our leadership understood very early on in the pandemic and captured that momentum and wanted to direct staff to keep doing that work across our departments, across our services. So that's part of it. And the other part of it that I think is really critical is empowering people who are already doing that within your organization to do it more, do it better, and teach others. So to that end, we have a really amazing program in the Office of Innovation called the Innovation Academy, where rather than sending our tiny team out to go, tell departments how to be innovative, instead we invite representatives from those departments to come learn, right, with us how to be champions for innovation and out of the box thinking, and bring that back to their departments and infuse their own department with that culture change. So we're adapting that Innovation Academy model to data governance as we're building out new policies and new directives for how San Antonio manages data. We're using that program as a way to drive that culture change from the bottom up, in addition to the top down.
Emily, I wanted to go back to something you touched on briefly earlier, which was the digital Bill of Rights that you guys have been working on. I know that started before COVID, but are there lessons that you've learned over the past year that have either kind of changed how you guys have developed those, or have you developed new rights based on anything over the past year?
So where that started, Aaron, was actually here at City of the Future 2 years ago. We had what at the time was a very progressive conversation with Bianca Wiley about digital rights and digital Bill of Rights, which we kind of came up with as a terminology on stage. And what we were really referring to was what kind of commitments can organizations make about how the public interest and human rights really are protected when we use emerging technology, when we use things like AI or put sensors in public space, and when we collect data about our residents to build better policies and programming. So we have, partially as a result of COVID-19, begun to develop an actual Bill of Rights that we're going to be revealing or sharing in the fall. That I'm really excited about. And it makes those sort of public commitments to what the city of San Antonio will and will not do with your data in terms of privacy to the accessibility of our digital services for everyone, including folks with disabilities, and really just outlining, what commitments we're willing to make. That being said, that drives a lot of change, and it requires a lot of development internally for how do we make good on some of those commitments in terms of building new infrastructure or changing the way that local government works. So we're taking all those lessons learned from the pandemic, and we're using that to drive change and communicate effectively with the public what we feel your rights and our commitments to those should be in those spaces.
We'll have to have you back in the fall so we can hear more about that. We've got about 3 minutes left. I just wanted to ask Chris and David what your, any final words to wrap up the panel. And Chris, I'll throw it to you first.
Thanks, Aaron, and I echo your comments to Emily. I think that San Antonio has really put a lot of thought into this, and can be your digital Bill of Rights can be a municipal and even governmental wide model for many communities and states around the country to take a look at that. I would just say that I think that the future for cities has seemed so uncertain for the past 15 months. The future for all of us has seemed uncertain for much of the past 15 months, but there is a lot to be hopeful and positive looking forward to. And I think that it requires a recommitment to collaboration, a recommitment to finding commonality among different stakeholders, different interest groups, and a recommitment to each other, and the idea that when we all do better, this is not my line, but when we all do better, we all do better. And so equity needs to be at have that primacy of position when we think about these types of transformative changes. Thank you all.
Thanks, Chris. And David, you have the last word today.
Last word. Okay, I'm gonna harp on it one more time. The pandemic has forced us to break a lot of bad habits and to rethink the way we do things. And we've come out of it doing it better, looking at people differently, being more inclusive, having better conversations. And there's absolutely no reason for us to go backwards. There's no reason to go back to the habits that we were at before. So, let's, I guess I can use this again, but let's let everybody take that second step and take all the good things that come out of the pandemic and show that intent and show that momentum and move it forward. And one other last thing, having worked with Detroit and San Antonio, y'all are very much sister cities. So hopefully that connection now, Chris, with you being there, stays intact, and there's a whole lot of information sharing that goes on.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chris, Emily, David. I really enjoyed the conversation today, and yeah, we'll stay in touch. We'll keep this conversation going. Thank you for joining us on the panel today.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.